Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Amit Kumar, Staff Research Analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies Program. And today I'm joined by my colleague Anushka Saxena, also a researcher at the Indo-Pacific Studies Program. The topic that I thought we'll discuss today will be again something that we keep coming back to, India-China relations. But this time, the twist that we have is that we're going to be discussing an issue which has come to light lately with respect to India-China relations and has garnered a lot of attention. The issue is that of Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama, in his statement on 2nd of July, he made a statement when he turned 90. And that statement triggered quite a reaction from around the world, including China, right? And to discuss this matter further, I have Anushka, who has authored and written about the issue and has come out with a discussion document uh, titled The Dalai Lama Turns 90 Scenarios Based Thinking on the Succession Issue. So, the succession issue has become very central uh, to this issue of Buddhism and India China relations and how these things interact, right? And therefore, I thought we'll have Anushka here today to discuss more about this. We'll try and understand the intricacies involved. Where does India stand? What are China's approaches? How is the West, especially the US, watching the issue? Right? So, Anushka, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on this show, Apit.
Okay, Anushka. So, the first question that I have, and I would like to begin with this, is the statement that Dalai Lama released on the 2nd of July when he turned 90. Uh, it ruffled a lot of feathers around the world, right? Could you take us through as to what that statement was? And why was that statement important, not just from the religious standpoint, uh, but also from geopolitical standpoint, especially when it comes to relations between India and China?
Right. Thank you so much for that question, Amit. So, yes, the day he turned 90, that was the 6th of July. But a few days before that, the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, who's currently based in India in Dharamshala, made a statement laying to rest a lot of speculation surrounding whether he is going to have a successor, which would be the 15th Dalai Lama, and how that successor would be chosen. Now, mind you, the broad context, and just to zoom out on this, is this, right? Um, a while ago, sometime around 2011, the Dalai Lama made some statements arguing that his institution might not even continue, and the world may not see another Dalai Lama, especially in this Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, of which Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, is the head. And then subsequently, he had statements surrounding how the next Dalai Lama could be a woman, how they could be born anywhere in the world, including India. And he specifically articulated this vision of his for who the next Dalai Lama might be in his book, Voice for the Voiceless, where he argued that it is highly likely that the next Dalai Lama, not even highly likely, he expressed his affirmation for the idea that the next Dalai Lama, the next person to head this Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, would be born in the quote unquote free world. Now, loosely, that means that this appointee, this designate, will be born outside of China. And this is important because Beijing has always wanted to exercise its dominance over the issue of who heads the Gaelic school. Moreover, Beijing has also argued that it is going to, by hook or by crook, assign its own head for this Gaelic school. So its own Dalai Lama designate, 15th Dalai Lama designate, right? And this is the first time in history that one is at this juncture, right? Because even the 14th Dalai Lama and all of his predecessors were either born in China or in the general area of Tibet. And at one point, it even included Mongolia as a tributary state to the Chinese imperial powers. So, the fact that the 14th Dalai Lama has claimed in a world today where boundaries are an important constituent of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that the next Dalai Lama, that his successor, will be born outside China, the government in Beijing has obviously, as you said, felt the feathers ruffle, right? And so very soon down the line, we might see a scenario where there is a designate that has been appointed in tandem with the processes the 14th Dalai Lama has suggested, and a parallel Dalai Lama appointee that the Chinese Communist Party puts up. Right now, what are the processes that the current Dalai Lama, who by the way is recognized by both China and the world, right, as well as Tibetans everywhere. So, what are the processes that he thinks will be pursued to find the next rightful heir? Um, One is that, and this is the most important one, and this was also a part of his July 2 statement, was that his trust, the Gaden Phodrang Trust, the foundation that's based in Dharamshala, will be the only rightful party to search for the next rightful designate. And this means that he has effectively said that no external party, may it be Beijing, some power in the US, or the government in India, none of them will be the authoritative voice on who the next Dalai Lama is. And so his trust is going to see that through. Of course, as I alluded to at the starting of my response, he has confirmed that the institution will indeed continue. So there will be an heir and there will be a head of the Gaelic school. But who that is going to be could range from anyone in India to anyone in the US, Mongolia, or Japan, which is what makes it so fascinating, right? To think about succession and its implications for geopolitics. Because if China is going to have an appointee and the Gaden Phodrang is going to find someone else, say in India or in Japan, it's definitely going to create tussle with China, with Beijing. And then there's also the issue of legitimacy, right? Who do the Tibetans believe is the rightful heir? It is likely that there would be more popularity and more legitimacy for the 15th Dalai Lama that is appointed by the Gaden Phodrang. Nonetheless, we should always think about a scenario where that legitimacy is low, primarily because in the past many kind of reincarnations of the Dalai Lama, we've seen that the issue that the Dalai Lamas have taken up as most important is the autonomy of Tibet and the liberation of Tibet, among other things. And so a Dalai Lama that is not born in Tibet or in China may primarily face issues on that account. So all of these mixes of factors and the varied dynamics at play is what makes the question so interesting, but also a challenging one, as it were.
Right. And at the outset, I think the fact that the Dalai Lama has chosen to continue the institution, he has ensured that Beijing remains locked in a struggle for legitimacy over Tibet, because Tibet is one region, although governed by the Chinese Communist Party, is a region where they are not very satisfactorily. They think that they control the region to the fullest, right? Because although they maintain they have the coercive power in the region. Legitimacy has been that one thing that they have always pursued and has evaded them. And the fact that the Dalai Lama managed to escape, and this, mind you, again, as you said, that this is the Dalai Lama that even the Chinese recognize, and the fact that he fled, right, it has kept that question of legitimacy open. And I think that makes for an interesting uh, issue, right? I mean, the appointment or the recognition of the Dalai Lama is always a political question, but the fact that this particular issue, the succession, this time, this would become a near global issue, is something that one needs to see and analyze, right? Uh, Coming to this, like the fact that this is so much, this has garnered so much significance, right? And especially how this would play out in India-China relations. And in the paper, you talk about India's locus standi on this whole question of the succession debate. And I remember when this statement was released by the Dalai Lama on, again, 2nd of July, there were a lot of commentaries and opinion pieces floating around the Indian mainstream media, where people asked the government to take a stand, to have a proper laid out Tibet policy, and that it will support the Tibetan refugee community here against China's claims. But if you remember, we also did a survey last year, and in that survey, a majority of people, what they had to say was that this is largely a religious issue and they should not weigh in on the issue. What is your take on this whole India's locus standi, and how should India respond?
Yeah, I think so. Notwithstanding the fact that India is where the current Dalai Lama operates, all of his institutions like the Central Tibetan Administration, the Parliament, which is also known as the Kashag, operate. Notwithstanding that fact, New Delhi does have a locus standi in the succession issue. Yes, after the Dalai Lama made his 2nd July statement, um, there was a statement by the Ministry of External Affairs also on July 4th, if I'm not wrong. And that statement was about how the government of India does not take a position on matters of beliefs and practices, on matters of faith and religion. And the government has always upheld the freedom of religion for everyone in India and will continue to do so. So, this was a statement that was pretty much along expected lines, because in the past, New Delhi has said that it treats the Dalai Lama as a welcome guest and a respected religious leader. They've also recognized his following in India. But beyond that, on the succession issue itself, the government has been very clear that it's not going to make a comment or participate or deny the freedom to the Tibetans to be able to elect the head of their Buddhist school. But beyond just the issue of succession, I think the fundamental challenge that comes in is with regards to how this impacts New Delhi Beijing ties, because China does not believe that the issue of the territory of Tibet and the recognition of Chinese sovereignty over the territory of Tibet is distinct from the issue of the Dalai Lama's political asylum. Because New Delhi has given the Dalai Lama political asylum in India, and yet on the issue of the territory of Tibet or the territorial recognition of Tibet, India has been very clear that we recognize the PRC's sovereignty over that region. And this was reiterated in a statement in 2003. So, this distinction in how both India and China approach the issue is primarily where the challenge lies. Because when on the 4th of July, the MEA made the statement, and then on the 6th of July, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also wished the 14th Dalai Lama best on his 90th birthday. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson commented, the spokesperson being Mao Ning, she commented that the Indian side should fully recognize the highly sensitive nature of the Tibet related issue, clearly understand the anti China and separatist nature of the 14th Dalai Lama, honor its commitments on Tibet related matters, speak and act with caution, and not interfere in China's internal affairs. Now, all of these distinctly but together represent just how important an issue of priority this is for the Chinese. And so, For them, even a slight deviation from exactly what they want another country to say is quote unquote interference in internal matters. And they'll immediately start reiterating their narrative on how the Dalai Lama is splittist, and that India grants him asylum is construed as interference, as not speaking and not acting with caution, so on and so forth. This is even though the Dalai Lama neither lives in Tibet nor does India make a comment on, say, Tibet's demand for autonomy or the status of Tibet, right? So, despite none of these factors existing, the Chinese want that India toe the line as it is. And so, clearly, where the big question, the $1 million question for the government, and where the locus standi as well comes in, is the dilemma that can India both keep China's concerns assuaged even as it allows religious freedom to bloom, right? So, this is about domestic priorities and policy, as well as India China relations. And especially in today's context, where we are seeing that there is a relative thaw in India China relations, which is an outcome of a long series of negotiations post Galwan. Um, do we really want to, put that in jeopardy again and have a very unstable and aggressive neighbor on our borders? So I think this is where both the government's dilemma and the locus standi come in, and it'll be interesting to see how this question is answered going forward.
Right. So, if I've understood it correctly, the position that the Indian government has taken so far that they will not interfere in the matters of succession. So that means that the Dalai Lama's Gaden Phodrang Trust will go ahead with its nomination and appointment of its own Dalai Lama, right? And the Chinese said that any such appointment would have to conform to their rules and regulations, etc. So, and as this announcement was made, there were also news that there are already back channel talks happening between the Kashag and the Chinese, right? But the Kashag spokesperson said that they are not very hopeful of any favorable outcome in that sense. So it largely gives me a sense that there would be two Dalai Lamas going ahead. Both China and Gaden Phodrang would have their two appointees. And then the question would be on the legitimacy. This brings me to the question on the scenarios framework that you have done in the paper. And this is a central contribution to the paper, which analyzes this scenario matrix based on two factors: uh, the birthplace of the next Dalai Lama and the legitimacy garnered by Gaden Phodrang Trust's appointee. And this is a beautiful 2x2 that you have created in your paper. Can you talk about this framework and what are the four scenarios that you analyze, and why did these variables emerge as the most crucial one in your assessment?
Yeah, so I think to start off with any 2x2, it has to be the case that two factors are orthogonal and a few factors have to be ceteris paribus, or assumed to be constant. Now, we know that the timeline that we're looking at for the issue of succession is maybe 5 to 10 to 15 years down the line. We know that sometime in the past, the 14th Dalai Lama had made a statement that he's going to live on till he's 113 years old. So, that's 23 years from now. So, if let's say that's the timeline we're looking for at, right? So, in this framework, we have assumed that the geopolitical and geoeconomic conditions that exist in the world today will be the same at the time that the succession actually comes about. And of course, another thing that I didn't highlight before, but it would be useful to highlight now, is that the 14th Dalai Lama has recommended that succession take place only after his passing away. So we might be looking at a longer timeline, right? So I assume in this framework that the geopolitical and geoeconomic situation is going to be the same. The nature of US China relations will be in a state of managed but continual competition. And I also assume that China will continue to accord the issue of succession and the issue of legitimacy of its own Dalai Lama appointee as high. Now, in this scenario, the two factors whose interplay I look at is legitimacy and birthplace. So I think these are really interesting to experiment with, because these induce the most degree of uncertainty in how any country, including India, would respond. So on the legitimacy factor, I talk about how the Gaden Phodrangs, and mind you, this framework is from the Gaden Phodrang's perspective. The Gaden Phodrang appointees, pardon me, perspective. So let's say there is a scenario where they have low legitimacy and another where they have high legitimacy. Then this is further complicated by their birthplace. So a scenario where uh, they are born in India or they are born outside India. Now we don't discuss citizenship in this, because again, in the past we have seen that Dalai Lamas have considered themselves to be stateless. So the citizenship issue only complicates it a bit further, in that whichever country the next Dalai Lama is found in by the Gaden Phodrang, they have to make a decision on whether they have to grant citizenship if the 15th appointee asks for it. Anyway, so this two by two then creates four scenarios. The first scenario is the locking horns scenario, where the Gaden Phodrang's appointee has high legitimacy and is born in India. Here, India and China will, as it were, lock horns, and so will the Gaden Phodrang's appointee and Beijing's appointee, because the Gaden Phodrang's appointee has high legitimacy, but China is powerful. A second scenario is a tussle of vulnerabilities, where the Gaden Phodrang's appointee has low legitimacy and is born in India. Then there is a fight or flight scenario, where the Gaden Phodrang's appointee has low legitimacy and is born outside India. So they fight, or they move to the new country where they would want to establish their office and continue their activities at a lower scale. And then there is a fourth scenario, which is a best of both worlds kind of a scenario. And this is especially from, say, the Indian government's perspective, where the Dalai Lama, the 15th appointee, is born outside India and also has high legitimacy. Now, just to give my RBF, as we call it at Takshashila, or bottom line up front, based on this, my assessment in the paper, for India, the least desirable scenario is the one where the Gaden Phodrang's appointee is born in India and is unable to establish legitimacy, because this would mean that China's state-appointed Dalai Lama will gain prominence. And then subsequently, the CPC could use coercive diplomacy to extract concessions, especially with countries with a substantial Tibetan Buddhist diaspora, including India. And such a scenario will undermine India's soft power leverage, if any, and it reduces India's negotiation power vis-a-vis China, forcing New Delhi to take a more cautious and reactive posture. Yeah, and side by side, the more desirable scenario for India would be the one in which Gaden Phodrang's appointee is broadly accepted, garners legitimacy, and is born in quote unquote a free world country outside China. Now, this outcome ensures to some degree that India maintains its standing among Tibetan Buddhist followers and countries supporting the trust's designate, because he or her are popular. It also enables India to check China's coercive influence over the reincarnation process to some degree, while also leveraging global support for the Dalai Lama's transition process. So I guess this is how the scenarios play out from my understanding and assessment, and happy to talk about it further.
Yeah, very interesting four scenarios, especially. I mean, you said that the scenario that India would prefer would be the one where the Gaden Phodrang appointee is born outside China and garners more legitimacy, right? So, but in case we do not see that outcome, and we have other outcomes that you have just shared of the four outcomes, right? So, would you care to explain as to what India's policy should be in each of these possible scenarios? Say for what if we land up in the first quadrant? What should be India's policy? And take us through all the four scenarios, and how should India react to each of these possibilities?
Sure. Thanks. So this would be a relatively longer answer, so please bear with me. So basically, I think the first quadrant, which is the locking horn scenario, we see that the 15th appointee of the trust maintains high legitimacy and their birthplace is in India. Here, China is likely to choose a show of force over diplomacy and acceptance. And basically, the show of force will be targeted towards a threefold goal: to convince India and other governments to recognize the Chinese Dalai Lama, including through public acknowledgement and support, to make countries waver in their support for the trust's appointee, and to convince governments to restrict mobility for the trust's appointee. And then, to be able to achieve these goals, China may deploy a toolkit that ranges from military coercion to compellence through economic tools. Now, the main of bone of contention between India and China in this scenario would be China's belief that the Indian government has not done enough to kind of recognize China's appointee and to restrict the activities of the Gaden Phodrang Trust. And so, um, in this scenario, the Indian state's policy will have to differ according to what its priorities are. So, let's say it's in India's national interest to maintain stability in its ties with China. Then New Delhi may want to place express curbs on the freedom of mobility of Tibetan Buddhist believers, both in India or those traveling to Dharamshala from foreign countries. This is especially given that the trust's appointee is an Indian born. So the state will have to consider a balance between the right to religious practice and preaching and the maintenance of quote unquote national security. So this is if India's national interest dictates that it have stable ties with China. But if the approach is to put up a posture of confidence without towing China's line, the state may choose to publicly support the Gandhi Phodrang's appointee as well. Now it's extremes, right? If in the former scenario, this Indian government may either also choose to publicly acknowledge and recognize the Chinese appointee. But this is just the extreme to which the policy response may go. Further, India may enable mobility, freedom of organization, foreign travel through eased visa processes. All of this, again, is if the New Delhi's approach is to put up a posture of confidence. And let's say the goal is to maintain ambiguity. In that case, the government, the state may not want to engage with the results at all. And, in needless to say, in all of this, the goal for India should be to act in its national interest regardless of the pressures from either China or even the Gaden Phodrang, right? And despite the results, it should both continue to invest in de-risking and border security with China without suspending high-level political dialogue. Then subsequently, it gets simpler to understand what India could do with the other kind of scenarios. Because in a tussle of vulnerabilities where the Gaden Phodrang's appointee has low legitimacy and is an Indian born, it's just that New Delhi's situation will be very complicated and it will find it challenging to play the metaphorical Tibet card against China in the coming years. So then New Delhi may want to provide minimal support to the Dalai Lama. India's national interest would likely revolve around avoiding pressure from China, given the high legitimacy of the Chinese appointee. So, in this regard, if India feels it is in its national interest, India may even recognize the Chinese appointee. Then there are the two scenarios where the 15th appointee of the Gaden Phodrang is born outside India. So one is where they have significant legitimacy, right? Here, India may not really have to worry too much about what the direct implications from China are, but it would want to kind of support Tibetan Buddhism and its right to choose and all of that. And it may want to establish friendly ties with the country where the Dalai Lama will be going, right? So, based on the status of the relationship with China, India may also go further and say that, look, now that the Dalai Lama is transitioning to another country, we are okay if we can put this issue behind us. So that could be useful. And in the meantime, India can continue enabling a smooth transition to the other country. And finally, if the 15th appointee of the trust is not able to gain the right amount of legitimacy and is born outside India, the government may restrict mobility of believers, avoid concessions on visa policy, reaffirm commitment to, say, not commenting on religious affairs, and all of this. And again, the extreme option of recognizing China's appointee is always there. So I think that's the length and breadth of what India's options, or at least the pathway to thinking about options is like. But yeah, the situation is dynamic and evolving, and we can't say for sure what we will be faced with.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, Anushka, what you have just laid out, the policy options that India has in each of these four scenarios, right? But this is what we talked about India. India, of course, is one of the primary stakeholders besides China and the Dalai Lama and his institutions. But I think other stakeholders, such as, and largely the Buddhist world, I think will also be a prominent one to look at, and how the story develops in each of those countries, especially three countries where Tibetan Buddhism is actually followed, starting from Mongolia, Bhutan, and Nepal. Insofar as I see Bhutan, I think because although it follows the Tibetan school of Buddhism, but it has its over the last 1,000 years, it has developed its own features of Tibetan Buddhism, and it does not belong. The largely what the sect which is followed there is different from the Gelug sect, and both Bhutan and Tibet already have their whole history of wars, territorial wars in the past, and therefore I think that even though Bhutan belongs to that sect of Tibetan Buddhism, I don't think they'll likely weigh in on the issue, and therefore I think they might not. The Gelug sect or the Gaden Phodrang appointee might not attract that kind of support from Bhutan. Nepal is another country, I think, right? But again, Nepal, the other sect of Tibetan Buddhism is followed that is different from the Gelug sect, and therefore, and if I'm not mistaken, Dalai Lama has not visited Nepal after 1986, and that has largely been done at the behest of the Chinese, right? And therefore, even from the Nepalese state, I don't think the Gelug sect or the Gaden Phodrang appointee might have much of support. Mongolia is a tricky one, right? Because Mongolia is actually that one country where actually the Gelug sect is practiced, and in fact, the third highest Lama is stationed in Mongolia, the highest Lama of in Mongolia, and overall the third highest in the Gelug sect is the one who was identified by the Dalai Lama very recently, and he heads the monastical order in Mongolia, right? But the fact that Mongolia, only 50% of Mongolian population is actually Buddhist, so it remains to be seen to the extent that the Mongolian state will go to either defend or support the Gaden Phodrang appointee, right? Especially because it's a landlocked country between Russia and China, and China can actually turn the screws, right? So it will be interesting how these questions play out in other countries and part of the other Buddhist world. Japan is another country, right? Japan is another country, and it will be lovely to see how the US, the European partners, and Japan react to this issue. But with that, I think, Anushka, this was a fascinating conversation, and we had a lovely discussion on this, and I hope that our listeners had a lot to take back, and they had a lot to learn. And do tell us, what do you feel and how the things will pan out in the coming years. I think this issue is going to be lively one for the next 2 to 3 years until the next appointment is made. With that, it's a wrap on the show, and thank you so much, Anushka. It was lovely having the discussion with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.